My name is Elena Brooks. I was sitting on a plane at Denver International Airport when a flight attendant slid a white napkin onto my tray table and kept walking like nothing had happened. Her name tag said Rachel. She did not smile, she did not look at me, but her hands were shaking. When I opened the napkin, my heart dropped. The words were written in fast, uneven ink. Pretend you are sick. Get off this plane now. You are not safe. For one strange second, I almost laughed. It sounded ridiculous, like something from a bad movie. But then I looked up and saw her at the end of the aisle. Rachel had turned around and was staring straight at me. There was no humor in her eyes, no confusion, just raw fear, the kind you see in people right before something terrible happens. I was 31 years old, a travel nurse, someone who had spent years watching heart monitors go flat and families fall apart in hospital hallways. I knew what real panic looked like, and Rachel was not pretending. The plane was already full. People were buckled in. A child was kicking the seat in front of him. A businessman was arguing softly into his phone. Everything looked normal, but that napkin felt like a loaded gun in my hands. I was supposed to be flying to Seattle to surprise my father, who was recovering from a stroke. He had no idea I was coming. I was supposed to land, hug him, and start a new chapter of my life. Instead, I was sitting there holding a warning that told me I might not land at all. I looked down at the words again. Pretend you are sick. Get off this plane now. And suddenly, I knew this was not a joke. I am not the kind of person who panics easily. For most of my adult life, I have worked in emergency rooms and trauma wards. I have held the hands of strangers while doctors told them they were dying. I have learned how to keep my voice calm even when everything inside me is screaming. That is why what I felt in that moment was so unsettling. It was not fear, it was recognition. I had spent the last 10 years taking care of everyone except myself, patients, families, even a boyfriend who drained me emotionally and financially before I finally walked away. When that relationship ended, I took travel nursing jobs just to feel free again. New cities, new hospitals, no one to answer to, just me and my scrubs and my suitcase. This trip to Seattle was supposed to be my reset. My father had suffered a stroke 3 months earlier. He was stubborn and proud and hated letting anyone see him weak. I had been calling him every night, listening to him struggle through physical therapy. I wanted to walk into his apartment unannounced and see his face light up. I wanted to remind him that he was not alone. That is who I was, a daughter trying to hold her family together, a nurse who believed in quiet resilience, not someone who expected danger on a routine flight. As I sat there holding that napkin, I felt something crack inside me. All the rules I lived by told me not to overreact. Do not make a scene, do not assume the worst. But every instinct I had learned in medicine told me something else. When someone who knows the danger tells you to move, you do not sit still and debate. You act. I just had to decide if I was brave enough to listen. The cabin felt different once you noticed it. Not loud, not chaotic, just slightly off in a way that made your shoulders tense without knowing why. The air had a heaviness that did not belong on a routine afternoon flight. Across the aisle from me sat a man in a dark jacket who had not spoken a single word since boarding. He kept his phone in his hand, but never looked at the screen. His eyes kept drifting forward toward the cockpit door, then back down the aisle, as if he were counting something invisible. When he noticed me glance at him, he looked away too quickly. 2 rows ahead, a teenage boy sat pressed against the window, hugging a black backpack against his chest, not resting it on his lap, holding it. His lips moved as if he were whispering to himself, not singing, not talking, repeating something under his breath like a prayer. Near the front, a woman in a gray business suit kept tapping her foot so hard the whole row shook. She pretended to read a paperback, but her eyes never stayed on the page. Every few seconds she looked toward the aisle, then toward the overhead bins, then toward the cockpit again. None of this would have meant anything on its own. People are strange on airplanes. Some hate flying, some hate being trapped. But taken together, it felt like walking into an emergency room where everyone is pretending nothing is wrong, even though the alarms are about to start. Rachel was moving up and down the aisle, pretending to check seatbelts and overhead compartments, but she was not looking at bags. She was watching faces. She paused by certain rows longer than others. When she passed mine, she did not look at me, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. I had the strange thought that whatever was happening on this plane was not random. It was controlled, monitored, waiting. I looked down at the napkin again. "You are not safe." The words felt heavier now, not dramatic, just true, and for the first time, I wondered if I had already been chosen for something I didn't understand. Rachel came back to my row as the last few passengers were settling in. This time, she did not pretend to check anything. She leaned down just enough that only I could hear her. "If you want to live, you need to listen to me." Her voice was steady, but it was forced, like someone holding a door shut against a storm. I felt a chill run through my arms. I asked her what she meant, but she shook her head slightly. "Not here. Not now. Just do exactly what I wrote." I looked down at the napkin again and then back up at her. "Why me?" I whispered. She hesitated for half a second. "Because you were sitting in the wrong seat." Those words hit harder than anything else. This was not about me being unlucky. This was about me being in the wrong place at the worst possible time. She straightened up as another flight attendant passed. Her face became professional again, but before she walked away, she added one more thing in a breath so soft I barely caught it. "Someone is waiting for whoever is in that seat." My pulse pounded in my ears. I felt suddenly exposed, as if a spotlight had been turned on just for me. I looked around the cabin again. The man in the dark jacket was watching the aisle. The woman in gray was gripping her book so hard her knuckles were white. The teenage boy was rocking slightly back and forth. Nothing had happened yet, but everything felt like it was about to. Rachel continued down the aisle as if nothing had been said. To everyone else, she was just another flight attendant doing her job. To me, she had just dropped me into the middle of a nightmare I didn't understand. I had no idea who they thought I was. I only knew that if I stayed where I was, someone was going to act, and when they did, I would be right in the middle of it. My seat number was 14C. I had barely noticed it when I boarded, just another middle seat on another crowded flight, but now it felt like it had a target painted on it. Rachel returned a few minutes later, pretending to hand out water cups. When she reached me, she let one rest on my tray and leaned in. "You changed flights this morning, didn't you?" she asked quietly. I nodded. My original flight had been delayed, so I took an earlier one. I thought it was luck. Her jaw tightened. It was not. She glanced down the aisle before continuing. "The person who was supposed to be in that seat is someone very important, someone people want gone." I stared at her. "Gone? How?" She didn't answer directly, just said, "They will act once we're in the air." My stomach twisted. I imagined the plane at 30,000 feet. Nowhere to run, no way out. "Why hasn't anyone stopped it?" I asked. "They're trying," she said, "but we can't do anything until you move." Until I move? It finally made sense in a horrible way. As long as I was sitting there, the people watching would think the real target was still in place. If I stayed seated, whatever was planned would happen right on schedule. But if I stood up, if I left, if the seat was suddenly empty, their timing would break. "You are the signal," she said softly. "When you move, everything changes." I felt dizzy. I was not a hero. I was just a nurse trying to see my dad. But somehow, my choice in that moment mattered more than anything. I looked toward the cockpit. The man in the dark jacket was watching it too. He glanced at me, then away again. Rachel squeezed my arm just enough to be felt. "If you stay here, you will not survive this flight." There was no drama in her voice, no exaggeration, just fact. I tried to think clearly, but fear has a way of scrambling logic. Part of me wanted to believe this was all a misunderstanding, a mix-up, a tired flight attendant reading too much into something small. But every time I looked at Rachel, I saw the same thing. She was not guessing, she was reacting. The engines were starting to hum louder. The plane was preparing to move. Once we left the gate, everything would become harder. Whatever they were waiting for would be closer. Rachel walked past my row again, this time with another attendant. They pretended to be chatting, but she brushed her fingers against my arm as she passed. That was the signal. Now. Now. I slowly unbuckled my seatbelt. The click sounded too loud in the quiet cabin. A few people looked up, annoyed that someone was standing during departure. As I rose into the aisle, I felt eyes on me. The man in the dark jacket lifted his head. The woman in gray froze mid-page. The teenage boy tightened his grip on the backpack. Rachel appeared at my side instantly. "Ma'am, are you feeling unwell?" she asked loudly. Her voice was gentle for the others, but urgent just for me. I nodded. I felt unwell in every possible way. She took my arm as if to support me, but her grip was firm and deliberate, guiding me forward, away from 14C. "Do not look back," she whispered. "They are watching." We started walking toward the front of the plane. Each step felt like it was being measured by someone else. I could feel the tension stretching tighter, like a wire about to snap. When we reached the galley, she sat me down on the jump seat. Another attendant brought a bottle of water. To everyone else, it looked like a routine medical issue. To me, it felt like stepping into the middle of a chessboard where every move could get someone killed. Rachel leaned in again. "They think you are still in that seat," she said. "We need to keep it that way until we turn back." "Turn back?" I repeated. She nodded once. "Or this ends very badly." Rachel stepped away from me and picked up the intercom. To anyone listening, she sounded calm and professional, but I was close enough to hear the strain in her breath. "Captain, this is Rachel. We have a medical escalation in the cabin, requesting immediate return to gate." There was a pause, the kind that feels much longer when you're afraid. Then the captain answered, asking for confirmation. Rachel did not hesitate. "Confirmed," she said. The engines changed pitch. I felt the plane slow slightly. A ripple of confusion spread through the cabin. People started murmuring. Someone groaned loudly about being late. A baby began to cry, but not everyone was annoyed. The man in the dark jacket sat up straighter. His eyes darted toward the cockpit, then back to the aisle. The woman in gray reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. Her hands were shaking as she typed. The teenager let out a sound that was half relief and half panic. Rachel positioned herself between me and the aisle. To anyone else, she was just blocking foot traffic. To me, she was a shield. "If we do not get back to the gate in time, they may try something anyway," she whispered. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The plane turned slowly. I could see the terminal lights through the window sliding back into view. We were close, but not close enough. That was when the teenager suddenly stood up. "I need to get off this plane," he said loudly. His voice cracked. "Please." Heads turned, people stared. The tension that had been hiding under the surface finally broke. The man in the dark jacket moved too. Not fast, calculated. His hand slid toward his carry-on bag. Rachel raised her voice. "Sir, please take your seat." He did not. That was when everything stopped pretending to be normal. Two men who had been sitting quietly in first class stood up at the same time. They were not dressed like law enforcement, no uniforms, no badges, but the way they moved told a different story. Calm, controlled, purposeful. Air marshals. One of them stepped into the aisle and raised his hand. Everyone remained seated. The man in the dark jacket froze. His fingers were still hooked around the zipper of his bag. His eyes flicked to me, then to Rachel, then back to the marshal. For the first time, his palm cracked. Another passenger near the emergency exit lunged toward the door. A flight attendant tried to block him and was shoved aside. People screamed. Someone dropped a phone. The cabin filled with panic. The teenage boy shouted, "No, stop, you do not understand." His voice was breaking with fear and guilt. The marshals moved fast. One restrained the man by the exit. The other advanced on the man in the dark jacket. He did not fight. He smiled faintly, like someone who had already accepted how this would end. Rachel stepped into the aisle. "Do not touch any overhead compartments," she said loudly. One of the marshals nodded and reached up to a specific bin, the one directly above seat 14C, my seat. He pulled it down carefully. Inside was not a bag, it was a small, sealed device wrapped in wires and metal. A single red light blinked slowly on its surface. The entire cabin went silent. The man in the dark jacket looked almost satisfied, like a magician revealing the final trick. The marshal did not touch it. He scanned it with a handheld device. Rachel watched his face change. It's live, the marshal said quietly. My breath caught in my chest. I had been sitting directly under that thing minutes ago. The teenage boy collapsed back into his seat, shaking. I was not supposed to be here, he kept whispering. They changed the flight. They changed everything. It was no longer just fear. It was reality. We were not dealing with the threat. We were sitting under it. The captain came out of the cockpit, his face pale and tight with disbelief. He looked straight at Rachel. "Is it active?" he asked. She nodded once. Security teams were already moving. Passengers were being told to stay seated as officers surrounded the area around 14C. No one was allowed to touch anything. Not a bag, not a phone, not even a jacket. Rachel turned to me. Her voice was softer now. "You were never the target." I stared at her. The person who was supposed to sit in that seat was a federal whistleblower, someone traveling under a protected identity, someone very powerful people wanted erased. My legs felt weak. I had changed my flight that morning without thinking, without knowing that a seat I took out for convenience had been marked for death. "You took his place," she said. "That's why we had to move you." The teenager was being escorted away by officers. Tears were streaming down his face. He was not a criminal. He was a pawn, someone who had been forced to play a role he could not escape. The woman in the gray suit was also being detained, not as a suspect, as an agent, another set of eyes watching the same trap from a different angle. Everything had been layered. Every person in that cabin had been part of a larger picture, and I had walked straight into the center of it without even knowing. Rachel met my gaze. "That napkin saved your life." I believed her. We were evacuated row by row from the back of the plane. The air outside felt unreal, like stepping into another world after being underwater too long. Police cars and emergency vehicles lined the runway. Red and blue lights flashed against the side of the aircraft. I walked with my arms wrapped around me, not because I was cold, but because I needed to feel solid, alive. Rachel stayed close to me until federal agents took over. One of them guided me toward a quiet area away from the cameras and the shouting passengers. My phone finally reconnected to the network. It exploded with messages, missed calls from my father, texts from my sister who was supposed to be filming my surprise, notifications from news alerts I did not want to open. I called my dad. When he answered and I heard his voice, I broke down. Not loud, just a soft shaking cry that wouldn't stop. He kept telling me it was okay, that I was okay, that I was safe. But safe felt like a strange word after what had almost happened. I kept thinking about how close I had been to never making that call, to never hearing him again. Rachel found me a few minutes later. She looked different now, less like a flight attendant, more like what she really was, a woman who made a choice. "You did good," she said quietly. I did not feel brave. I felt lucky, and that made everything harder to understand. In the days that followed, I gave statements and answered questions I never imagined I would have to face. Agents explained that the group behind the attack had been planning it for months. They were trying to make it look like a tragic aviation accident. No one would question a malfunction at 30,000 feet. Except something went wrong. I went wrong. They never expected the wrong person to take the seat. Rachel had been tracking small irregularities in the cabin long before I ever boarded. When she saw my last-minute seat change, she knew the pattern had shifted. That's why she acted. That's why she took the risk of warning me. My name appeared in the news. The real target was protected. The public was told a threat had been prevented. That was all. But I could not go back to who I had been before. Every sound felt louder. Every crowded room felt different. Not frightening, just sharper, like I could see the edges of things I had ignored before. I started trusting my instincts in a way I never had. If something felt wrong, I listened, not because I was afraid, but because I understood how fragile ordinary life really is. People think danger announces itself with sirens and shouting. Most of the time, it doesn't. It whispers. It hides behind normal moments, and it waits for someone to miss the signal. I almost missed mine. I never did again. I share this story not because I want sympathy, but because I want awareness. Too many of us are taught to ignore our instincts, to be polite, to not make a scene, to stay in our seats even when everything inside us is telling us to move. But sometimes that quiet voice in your chest is the only thing standing between you and something you cannot undo. That day, a stranger took a risk for me. Rachel could have followed procedure, she could have stayed silent, but she chose to trust what she saw and act on it. Because of her, hundreds of people walked off that plane alive, including me. So if you ever find yourself in a moment that feels wrong, even when you can't explain why, don't brush it away. Don't wait for proof. Pay attention. That feeling is not panic, it's protection. If this story meant something to you, if it made you stop and think for even a second, then please support this channel. Like this video, share it with someone you care about, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your voice matters, your awareness matters, and sometimes just paying attention can save a life. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next story.